Welcome to Community Gardening 101, Starting and Sustaining a Community Garden. I'm Megan Gregory, and I coordinate the Forsyth Community Gardening Program at North Carolina Cooperative Extension here in Forsyth County, North Carolina. In this webinar, we're going to walk through the steps of starting and sustaining a community garden. Whether your group is just getting started or has been gardening together for years, I hope you'll take away some useful ideas and practices. The webinar will mention some resources that are specific to community gardens in Forsyth County, North Carolina, but most of the information should apply to community gardens anywhere. Before we get started, I want to mention that I'll be pointing you to lots of great resources throughout the webinar, but please don't worry about scribbling down all the links. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to complete a brief online evaluation form. Upon submitting the form, you'll receive a link to download a PDF document with clickable links to all the online resources I'll mention. In this webinar, you will learn basic information about community gardens, such as what they are and why people become involved. We'll also touch on successful approaches to cultivating the garden community, which is the foundation for a sustainable, long-lasting community garden. We'll highlight asset-based community development and community organizing principles that will help you get and keep people involved and foster shared responsibility and leadership. Finally, we'll spend most of the webinar walking through the steps to starting and sustaining an active community garden. These include forming a leadership team, organizing the garden, finding a good site, designing and planting the garden, and finally, maintaining the garden and making good use of it with activities that bring people together. As we cover the steps to success, I'll highlight more detailed resources to guide you along the way. Most of these are linked from Forsyth Community Gardening's online Guide to Starting a Garden, which you can access at the address listed here. We begin with some basic information about community gardens. So what is a community garden? First and foremost, it's actually a community of people who come together to garden. Often, we think of the plantings as the garden, but there's no community garden without community. Of course, a community garden is also a public space where members cultivate crops, flowers, shrubs, and trees according to the group's goals and interests and the needs of their community. By this definition, community gardens are found in diverse contexts. There are neighborhood gardens where individuals and families often can have their own space to grow food and flowers, but community gardens are also found in schools and daycare centers, faith communities, and a wide range of service agencies and community organizations like recreation centers, senior centers, health clinics or physical therapy clinics, and more. In many community gardens connected to organizations, the garden group may plant and maintain the garden together and use the garden and its produce to fulfill their mission. Whether this is providing fresh produce for people in need, helping kids learn where food comes from, offering horticultural therapy, or another worthy goal. People become involved with community gardens for many reasons. Community gardeners may be seeking improved food access and nutrition, or overall health and wellness through the exercise, stress relief, and mental health benefits that gardening provides. Many gardeners are motivated by a desire to improve environmental quality and provide urban green space, and others seek to provide education, build friendships, or organize their neighborhoods around other common concerns. Understanding what goals your community seeks to fulfill through your community garden is really important when you're deciding things like how your garden will be organized and designed, and what kinds of activities and programs you'll have. Before we launch into the steps of starting and sustaining a garden, I want to cover guiding principles and practices for creating and sustaining the community of people that make up a community garden. Many aspiring garden organizers start by looking for land, a grant for materials, or a local business to donate lumber and topsoil for raised beds. But in a survey of garden support organizations across the United States and Canada, one of the biggest challenges for garden organizers was actually getting new people involved and sustaining that participation. Respondents named community participation as a significant challenge more than twice as often as land or materials used in the garden. The American Community Gardening Association has long recognized that community participation and ownership are part of the foundation for a successful community garden. Their Growing Communities curriculum helps garden groups develop skills to engage people in community gardening, involve them in meaningful ways, and build the capacities of all garden members. One of its key insights is that community gardening is most successful and long-lasting when people that are affected by the garden have a role in leading the development of the garden. This curriculum promotes asset-based community development as a promising approach for starting and sustaining gardens. This is defined as a process by which neighborhood regeneration can be achieved by locating assets in a community and connecting them with one another in ways that multiply their effects. Asset-based community development involves, first, identifying local assets, which may include gifts and talents of individual members, small groups within the community, access to land, water, or buildings, and resources and support from institutions and businesses. These could include information and technical assistance, volunteers, and in-kind or financial donations. Second, asset-based community development involves focusing internally to define a local agenda based on the hopes and needs of the surrounding community and building local capacity. Third, this approach to community development involves strengthening relationships between residents, associations, and institutions so that people and groups can collaborate to achieve shared goals. Community organizing is a key process in asset-based community development and has many applications in community gardening. Good community organizing begins by engaging people with personal invitations and learning their interests and strengths. This can be done with formal interest surveys or less formal one-on-one meetings or group activities. To ensure that garden members feel a sense of ownership and commitment to the garden, they should be involved in deciding on the garden's mission, organization, design and plantings, and what kind of educational and social activities you'll have. Your group will also want to create systems to ensure that everyone has a leadership role and that responsibility for maintaining the garden is shared. Later in the webinar, we'll outline examples of effective systems for different types of community gardens. Finally, providing continuous learning opportunities will strengthen your garden as members develop new skills and put them into practice. With these overarching tips in mind, let's look at the steps to starting and sustaining an active community garden. The steps to success include, first, forming a leadership team, second, organizing the garden, third, choosing a good site and securing tenure or formal permission to use the land, fourth, designing, preparing, and planting the garden, and finally, maintaining the garden with sustainable horticultural practices and active programming. Of course, many of these steps will be going on at the same time, but all are important to consider when you're starting or revitalizing a community garden. We're going to review each of these steps very briefly today, but the Forsyth Community Gardening website has a guide to starting a garden. This has links to resources to help you along the way, like worksheets, sample documents such as garden leases, guidelines, and plot holders agreements, and more detailed garden startup guides. The first step to success is bringing together people who are committed to making the garden a success. Forming your leadership team will start by talking with friends, neighbors, and local associations to identify people who are interested. You can adapt the interest surveys found on our website to learn more about folks' availability, skills, and ideas for the garden. As you pull together a group, keep in mind that the leadership should include, first and foremost, actual gardeners. This may sound quite obvious, but it's actually quite common for well-meaning outside agencies or volunteers to start a garden for other people who may never have been asked if they want to garden. Not surprisingly, these gardens often don't last very long. So the lesson here is that the people who want to plant and maintain and harvest crops should be on the planting team. If you can't find enough of those people for your planting team, you may need to reconsider the garden until you can find enough people. Second, I suggest striving to involve people with a variety of backgrounds and skills, such as horticultural knowledge, construction, volunteer management, and communications. All of these skills can contribute to a community garden. For school gardens, it's also important to have administrators, grounds managers, teachers, and parents on board. Once you have 4 to 10 people together, you can organize several core group meetings. At these meetings, you'll want to first determine the feasibility of the garden. The group should think hard and honestly answer the question, Is there really sufficient interest, or are you planning the garden and hoping that people will come? If you're still hoping they'll come, you may want to rethink the project until you have enough committed members for your leadership team. If you do decide that a new garden is a good idea, you can plan next steps and assign everyone jobs to accomplish before the next meeting. These might include additional community outreach, finding and assessing potential sites and resources, and planning and publicizing a community-wide organizational meeting. The next step is to organize the garden. That is, to set up systems that will keep people working together smoothly. This will occupy a series of meetings. Key garden organization tasks include crafting a mission statement, deciding key questions about garden management, developing guidelines and gardener agreements for allotment gardens where people have their own garden spaces, or if you're planning to have a communal garden, you'll want to develop systems of shared garden maintenance and harvesting. And finally, developing leadership roles to help implement the guidelines or systems. Before we look at these in more detail, I want to note that there's a collection of garden organization worksheets and sample documents on the Forsyth Community Gardening website at the direct link listed here. Crafting a garden mission statement will focus and guide all of your decisions and activities. So first, let's clarify what a garden mission statement is not. It's not something that one person makes up and writes down to fill space in a grant application. If one person just makes it up without discussing with others, that's not going to reflect everyone's ideas, and it won't really help the group focus its activities. Instead, a mission statement is developed by garden members together. It states who will be involved in or affected by the garden and how, what goals the group wants to accomplish, and how the group will accomplish those goals. That is, the group's major activities. As one example, the mission of a daycare garden I've worked with is to provide preschool-aged children and their families with opportunities to learn where food comes from and how to grow it, develop healthy eating habits, and develop a love for taking care of the environment. This is a great starting point for deciding what should be planted in the garden and what activities are important. The leaders of this garden, for example, involve children in tending vegetables and provide information about vegetable gardening and seeds to families to try out at home. They also use produce from the garden in meals served at the daycare center, and they established a garden with native plants to provide habitat for butterflies and other pollinators. So they very intentionally addressed the goals in their mission statement with garden plantings and activities to match. Once your participants and mission are clear, the group should decide if you will create an allotment garden, a communal garden, or some combination of the two. In allotment gardens, plots are assigned to individuals or families for their own use. In communal gardens, a larger space is cultivated collaboratively by the whole group, which then splits the harvest, or in many cases may donate a large portion of it. Both types of organization have advantages and disadvantages. Some advantages of allotments include, first and foremost, that gardeners tend to take more responsibility, at least for their own plots, because they benefit directly from diligent watering, weeding, and maintenance. This style of garden management also requires less coordination because people can work largely on their own schedules. A disadvantage of allotments is that there may be less guidance for new gardeners, and crop rotation can also be difficult unless each gardener has multiple distinct beds. This is because just moving tomatoes over to the other side of a small garden bed is not going to eliminate soil-borne diseases. Communal gardens are essentially the flip side. An advantage is that there's more guidance for new gardeners since the group works all together, and it's also easier to practice good crop rotation. The group can simply plant all crops of each family in distinct beds or areas and then rotate them each year. The main disadvantage of communal gardens is the tendency for gardeners to take less responsibility. In these gardens, a few people often end up doing most of the work unless there are very clearly assigned responsibilities. It also takes much more coordination and communication to have a successful communal garden. That said, all community gardens usually include common areas such as food donation plots, pollinator gardens or borders of native plants, compost areas, and of course paths. So it's essential, no matter what your style of garden management, to create systems of accountability for common areas and tasks. For example, planned, collaborative workdays are important for tending to common areas. I also recommend writing a work requirement into the garden rules, stipulating a minimum number of hours that garden members need to devote to maintaining common areas, not just their own plots. It's also good for each gardener to have a job or serve on a committee that benefits the entire garden, like maintaining the compost or planning educational workshops. As with all rules, these requirements must be monitored and enforced in order to be useful. This brings us to the next garden organization task, setting up those systems of shared responsibility. If you create an allotment garden, there are many resources on garden organization. Your group will want to create garden guidelines or rules and written plot holders agreements. As a reminder, there are sample garden rules and plot holders agreements in the collection of garden organization resources at the link on your screen. As a group, you'll need to decide on specifics like the ones listed here. For example, will there be membership fees to cover expenses? If so, how will you keep garden membership accessible to people of limited resources? What are the standards for using and maintaining garden plots? Do people need to plant by a certain date in the spring, keep weeds under control, clean up crop residue by a certain date in the winter? Are there guidelines for gardening practices? Does the group want to limit which crops folks can grow or what kinds of products can be used? For example, many community gardens don't allow the use of toxic herbicides, pesticides, or fungicides in order to keep the garden safe for children. In considering how to keep the garden as a whole running smoothly, many groups require members to participate in a leadership role or committee that benefits the entire garden and to work a certain number of hours in common areas. These are just some of the questions the garden group should consider together. For a more comprehensive list, I encourage you to check out the sample documents on the Forsyth Community Gardening website, as well as more detailed guides linked from the Guide to Starting a Garden webpage. If you create a communal garden, there are far fewer resources out there on how to organize yourselves. Here, I will share the model that I've seen work pretty well in communally managed gardens here in Forsyth County. It has two components. The first is regular, usually monthly work days. At these events, your group can accomplish bigger tasks: bed building and repair, soil preparation, planting, cutting down cover crops, and larger harvests like sweet potatoes. These offer lots of opportunities for building friendships and education for families who may never have gardened. Of course, in between workdays, the garden does have to be maintained. So the second component of this communal garden management model is a rotation of people who sign up to tend the garden, often for a week at a time, although you could vary that depending on the schedules of your participants. These folks do the day-to-day things like watering, pruning, trellising, weeding, checking for pests and diseases, and harvesting things like spinach or tomatoes that come in little by little. You can use a poster or whiteboard for sign-ups, as in the photo on your left, or you can use an online tool like Sign Up Genius. Either way, it's important for the stewards to have some orientation to garden tasks from an experienced gardener and written guidelines with reminders of important tasks to complete with each garden visit. Again, in the collection of garden organization documents, there are sample garden steward instructions and a packet of resources to refer to. This includes things like pictures of pests and weeds to watch out for. It's also a good idea for a garden leader to send an update to the next steward each week on what tasks need to be done and what may be ready to harvest. This could be via email, or it could be on a whiteboard or other place in the garden. Once you know your priority goals and how the garden will be managed, you can identify tasks and leadership roles that are needed to implement the plan. These will vary depending on the garden, but here are some common roles. In allotment gardens, plot coordinators assign plots and ensure they're being maintained. In communal gardens, garden steward coordinators ensure that there's someone signed up for each week and that these folks have an update on seasonal garden tasks. Garden planning coordinators make up plant selection and crop rotation plans, particularly for communal gardens. Communications team members might schedule workdays, put announcements about upcoming activities in the bulletin, and make reminder phone calls or text messages for work days. Workday coordinators plan and lead group workdays and oversee management of common areas. Tool and supply coordinators can secure needed materials like soil deliveries. An education committee can organize workshops and coordinate mentoring for new gardens. And there may be other tasks and leadership roles depending on your garden's goals. I encourage you to brainstorm with your garden group to think about what roles would enrich your garden and help you accomplish your mission. If possible, I suggest giving people the opportunity to sign up for a job or committee according to their interests and skills. Try to have co-leaders for each group, as this will often make this task less intimidating for new members. It's really ideal for everyone to have an assigned job. This strengthens members' sense of connection to the garden and ensures that things get done, because if it's not assigned, it will not happen. So now we have good people and good systems for working together. It's time to find some good land and secure land tenure or permission to use the land. Horticulturally, the most important requirements for a vegetable garden are a water source, at least 6 to 8 hours of full sunlight per day, and soil. You have a couple of options as far as soil. If you plan to till the ground for in-ground beds, you need to make sure the soil is free of soil contaminants like heavy metals. If the land hasn't been used for buildings or other industrial activity like dry cleaning, you probably don't need special tests for metals or other pollutants. If it has, you should test for metals and other contaminants, and you may want to use raised beds with imported soil. Gardeners in North Carolina can find excellent information about testing for soil contaminants and a list of laboratories at the website listed here from the Duke University Superfund Research Center. If the site has soil that is contaminated, compacted, or very poor quality, raised beds with imported topsoil are ideal, but these will be more expensive to create. Another consideration is if you can install a fence sunk 6 to 12 inches into the ground. This may solve groundhog and deer problems that plague gardens without solid fencing. You'll also want a site that you have proper permission for long-term use. This will allow you to invest in infrastructure, soil building, and perennial plantings. First, be sure to check with your local city or county planning department to learn what regulations may apply to your gardening project. For example, in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, North Carolina, the city-county planning department has a website with guidelines pertaining to urban agriculture, including community gardens. If your garden is on the site of a school, congregation, or other organization, in many cases, support from the administration or other leadership is sufficient. Outside groups may want a written agreement granting permission to use the site. And you may also want to check that insurance policies will cover gardening activities. If you are developing an empty lot into a garden, there are often more considerations. The first step, of course, is to identify the landowner. Most planning departments have publicly available geographic information systems or GIS tools online, which you can use to find the owner of any parcel of land. Then you'll want to inquire about a lease, written permission to use the land. There is a link to a sample lease from the online Guide to Starting a Garden. To get permission to use the land, you may need liability insurance. The American Community Gardening Association has a partnership with Brunswick companies to provide insurance specifically for community gardens. More information is on their website. Finally, garden groups may need to go through permit processes depending on local regulations. Check with your local planning department to determine if you need a permit. To obtain one, you may need to submit site plans and other information about how you plan to use the land. So now we have good people, good systems for working together, and good land. It's time to design, prepare, and plant the garden. Begin by brainstorming garden elements that people would like to include. Plantings might include things like allotment vegetable garden plots, as well as common areas. The group might consider sharing the management of food donation plots, permanent beds for perennials like blueberries and herbs, and native plant areas or borders to provide habitat for beneficial insects that pollinate crops or prey on pest insects. Infrastructure elements might include a tool shed or lockable bin, a shade structure over picnic tables to create a comfortable space for teaching or socializing, a hand washing station, compost bins, or other elements the group would like to include. I also encourage garden groups to consider how the garden can be designed to enable full participation by people with disabilities. The resource Accessible and Inclusive Gardens from the National Recreation and Parks Association has excellent information on this topic. One common practice is to add some extra tall raised beds, which can be tended by people in wheelchairs, or may simply be easier to use for folks with back problems. You also need to consider how paths are designed so that people in wheelchairs can access the garden. Paths intended for wheelchairs should be firm, smooth, and level. Decomposed granite or rock dust is ideal for firmness and good traction. Paths should also be at least 5 feet wide so that the person can turn around. Once the group has selected the elements to include, these can be sketched onto a scale map of the site. There's a step-by-step guide of how to do this on our website. Here, you can see a simple site plan for a new garden. Most of the garden is vegetable beds, with ample path space for maintenance. There's also enough open space in the front of the garden for deliveries of compost or mulch. The group designated the back of the garden, where there's shade from trees, for a sitting area and a tool shed. Once you have this clear vision, it's time to make it a reality. For new in-ground gardens, you'll need to contract with the farmer to provide initial tilling services. Most garden tillers, even large ones, are not able to break new ground effectively. For raised bed gardens, you'll have to acquire lumber and hardware and either pick up or arrange for a soil delivery. Whichever model your group chooses, you'll need both equipment and materials for the build day. Equipment refers to things that you'll only need on the day you establish the garden, and so these could be borrowed. This includes things like a cordless drill to put beds together. Materials are those things that will stay in the garden, like fencing, landscape fabric, soil amendments, irrigation supplies, or rock dust for paths. As you can see from this list, gardens do require some financial resources to start and maintain, and this is a reality that it's good to plan for. Most community gardens rely on a combination of grassroots fundraising, in-kind donations from individuals and local businesses, small grants, and, in the most fortunate cases, regular support in the budget of a host organization. For more ideas and resources, check out the article on developing a fundraising plan at the link listed on your screen. There are many sources of grants for community gardens, including community foundations, hardware stores, businesses, and nonprofits. Faith communities in North Carolina should also check with Partners in Health and Wholeness, a project of the North Carolina Council of Churches that supports health promotion efforts by congregations of all faiths. National denominations also have grants for projects addressing food security and environmental stewardship. If your garden is associated with an institution, like a faith community, school, or social service organization, I encourage you to educate decision makers about the value of the garden in achieving the organization's mission and the need for modest, ongoing support to sustain gardening activities. In order to contribute to an organization's programming, gardens do need support, just like a literacy program needs money for books or a sports program needs money for equipment. Once you have the resources you need, you can plan work parties to clean up the site, prepare and build the garden, and put in your first plantings. The committees and leadership roles you established during the organization phase all have a role to play in these work days. Have the communications committee publicize the work days. The tool and supply coordinators ensure that all the materials you need are picked up or delivered. And the workday coordinators plan what tasks will be accomplished at each workday and who will supervise each task. As a guide for workday planning, I encourage you to look at the article, Steps to a Successful Garden Workday. It's full of great tips, like having a variety of tasks appropriate for all ages with team leaders for each, making sure you have the tools you need, and of course, refreshments. You can also ask experienced gardeners to share short lessons or demonstrations of garden tasks, like soil preparation or trellising. Once the garden is established, it's time to plant and maintain the garden with sustainable horticultural practices and make good use of it with activities that bring people together. Community gardens offer great opportunities for promoting best practices in sustainable horticulture, such as crop rotation planning, soil testing, cover cropping to protect and improve the soil, and cultural practices to manage insects, weeds, and diseases. Your local Cooperative Extension office can help you find information and develop a plan for your garden. Opportunities for bringing people together and for education include work days, educational workshops or activities such as cooking demonstrations, and social and community events. This concludes our webinar on Community Gardening 101, Starting and Sustaining a Community Garden. Please do check out the Guide to Starting a Garden on the Forsyth Community Gardening website for a summary of the material covered in this webinar and links to a wealth of resources. I also encourage you to get in touch with your local Cooperative Extension educators. They will be able to provide guidance tailored to your local context. Finally, please take a few minutes to complete an online evaluation of this webinar at the link listed on your screen. This will help Forsyth Community Gardening continue to improve the resources we create and share with community gardeners. Upon submitting your evaluation form, you'll receive a link to download a PDF document with clickable links to all of the resources mentioned in this webinar. Thank you and best of luck with your community garden.